Title: Devastation of the Wendigo. The snow lay thick and undisturbed on the forest floor, blanketing the trees in an eerie, quiet beauty. Dark pine trees stood sentinel, towering high, their branches heavy with fresh powder, as if frozen mid-whisper. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so, save for the soft crunch of snow beneath Ian's boots. Ian Mitchell was an outdoorsman, through and through. Born and raised in the rugged northern wilderness, he was used to solitude. For years, he had lived on the edge of a small town called Willow Creek, where he worked as a forest ranger, responsible for vast stretches of untamed woodland. But this winter had been different. Stories of strange happenings in the woods had begun to circulate, people disappearing without a trace, strange noises in the night, and sightings of something inhuman. He had brushed it off as superstition, something to be expected in a small town with a long, dark winter. But over the past few weeks, he'd started to notice things himself. Tracks he couldn't identify, deep gouges on trees, and the sensation of being watched. It had started to gnaw at him. Today, he had ventured deep into the forest, further than he usually dared in winter. As he walked, the trees grew denser, the light dimmer, and the silence heavier. He checked his compass, noting that he was close to the old hiking trail, the one that led to Frost Hollow, a place local hunters tended to avoid. The spot was legendary among the townsfolk for being haunted. Even the bravest kept their distance. But Ian was no stranger to ghost stories. He was here for answers. He paused, looking around. There was no sound of wildlife, not a single bird call, not even the distant howl of a wolf. The silence weighed on him, pressing against his ears, making him feel like he'd wandered into a place forgotten by time. That was when he noticed the smell, a faint, foul stench that seemed to hang in the air, metallic and decayed. He pressed on, despite the chill creeping up his spine. The ground became rougher, and the trees seemed to close in on him, twisting their branches like skeletal fingers. Then he saw something in the snow ahead, footprints, large and heavy, too big to be human and too deep to belong to any animal he knew. Ian knelt to inspect them, his breath fogging in the cold. The tracks were strange, like a fusion of human and animal, with long clawed toes that sunk deep into the snow. Whatever had left these prints was massive and bipedal, and they were fresh. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The prints trailed deeper into the forest, leading toward the heart of Frost Hollow. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but something else, a gnawing curiosity, pushed him forward. Just as he was about to rise, he heard it, a distant guttural howl that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that made his blood run cold, a sound that spoke of hunger, of something old and evil. Ian's hand tightened around the grip of his rifle. He felt the weight of the woods bearing down on him as he took a step forward, following the tracks, unknowingly stepping into the path of something he could never have imagined. The howl died away, leaving only the silence, and Ian walked deeper into the unknown, unaware that he was no longer alone. Ian's footsteps crunched in the snow as he followed the tracks, each step seeming louder than the last in the unnatural quiet. His heart hammered in his chest, every instinct telling him to turn back, but something unexplainable kept him moving forward. He told himself it was duty, his responsibility as a ranger to understand the wilderness, to protect those who might wander into its depths. But there was a deeper feeling within him, something closer to dread. The tracks twisted through the forest, weaving between the thick trees, leading him further from familiar ground and deeper into the twisted heart of Frost Hollow. The air grew colder, biting and raw, as if the forest itself was warning him away. Ian gritted his teeth, his breath puffing out in clouds of white mist as he pressed on, determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of something dark, looming in the trees up ahead. His heart skipped a beat, and he stopped in his tracks, squinting through the shadows. It was a small clearing, and in the middle stood an old, twisted tree, its branches reaching up like gnarled hands against the gray sky. At the base of the tree was something that made his stomach turn, a crude circle of stones, half buried in the snow, with strange symbols carved into them. He swallowed hard, a chill crawling up his spine. He recognized those symbols, They were Ojibwe, the language of the native people who had once lived in these lands. He knew only a little of the language, but he recognized enough to know the meaning, cursed ground, and keep away. Stories of dark spirits and cursed places were common in the local folklore, but he had always dismissed them as tales to scare children. Now, looking at the ancient warnings etched into the stones, he wasn't so sure. He stepped closer to inspect the strange formation, the silence around him seeming to thicken. As he knelt, he noticed something else, a faint glimmer in the snow, just beyond the circle. A silver bracelet half buried, the metal dulled by time. He picked it up, brushing off the snow, his stomach lurching as he recognized it. It belonged to Anna Lavoie, a young woman who had disappeared 2 weeks ago after going hiking near Frost Hollow. Ian had been part of the search team, scouring the woods for days, but they had found nothing. Her family had pleaded for answers, but after days of searching, hope had faded. Now here it was, proof that she had been here, drawn deeper into the forest like he was now. The realization hit him hard, filling him with both fear and grim determination. Whatever had taken Anna had left its mark here, and he was close to uncovering it. But then, as he rose to his feet, he heard something, a faint whisper on the wind, almost too soft to catch, but enough to freeze him in place. It sounded like a voice, but twisted, like a shadow of something once human. The words were unintelligible, little more than a harsh rasp, but the message was clear: leave. Ian's hand instinctively went to his rifle, his pulse pounding. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. But the forest remained still, as if holding its breath. The whisper faded, and he was left in a silence that felt even more oppressive than before. Taking a deep breath, he turned to leave the clearing, but his foot caught on something hard under the snow. Kneeling, he brushed away the snow and froze. It was another footprint, but this one was far larger than anything he'd seen before. It was as if a massive creature had pressed its foot into the earth, leaving deep grooves where claws had sunk into the frozen ground. Fear gnawed at him, and he forced himself to stand, gripping his rifle tightly. He knew now that he was dealing with something far beyond the natural world, something dark and ancient that defied explanation. But he also knew he couldn't turn back, not until he understood what had taken Anna, and maybe others, from this forest. A sudden rustling broke the silence, coming from the trees behind him. He spun around, raising his rifle, his breath catching in his throat. For a split second he thought he saw something, a tall, gaunt figure, half hidden in the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, catching what little light there was, and its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin, revealing jagged, sharp teeth. Ian's heart raced, but when he blinked, the figure was gone, as if it had melted into the shadows. Trembling, he backed away, his mind racing with questions. Was this the creature from the stories, the Wendigo of legend, the monster that preyed on the lost and desperate in the dead of winter? He took a shaky breath, feeling a chill unlike anything he'd ever known. Whatever it was real, and it was watching him. With a final glance around the clearing, Ian turned and walked back the way he came, his every instinct urging him to run. He hadn't found the answers he came for, but he knew one thing: the forest was not safe, and something dark and ancient was lurking within it. As he left the clearing, he heard the whisper again, faint and mocking, following him through the trees like a shadow. Ian's breath came in short, frosty puffs as he pushed through the forest, the whisper still lingering in his mind, as if etched into his thoughts. He kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him. Every sound, a snapping twig, the rustle of branches, the faint sigh of wind, felt like it belonged to something following him, something unseen and relentless. As he retraced his path, he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. The figure in the shadows, the strange footprint, the lingering scent of rot. There was no way to rationalize it. He had spent years in these woods, encountering every type of wildlife and weather imaginable. But this was something different, something he couldn't explain away with science or experience. His mind raced back to the stories he had heard in his childhood, tales told by the elders of Willow Creek. They spoke of a creature born of cold and hunger, a spirit twisted by greed and starvation, cursed to roam the forests forever. The Wendigo. Ian had dismissed it as folklore, a frightening story meant to keep kids out of the woods. But now, with the memories of that twisted figure fresh in his mind, he began to wonder if those stories were more than just tales. As he walked, he tightened his grip on Anna's bracelet, feeling the cold metal press into his palm. He could only imagine what she must have felt, alone and terrified in the depths of this forest. A part of him wished he could turn back, leave this place and the terrible mysteries it held, but he knew he couldn't. He needed answers, for her family, and for himself. He was nearing the forest's edge, close enough to see the faint glow of his cabin through the trees, when he heard the sound again, the same guttural howl that had stopped him in his tracks earlier. But this time, it was closer, resonating through the trees with an intensity that made the ground feel as if it were trembling beneath his feet. Ian's heart pounded as he spun around, his eyes scanning the shadows. The howl was filled with hunger, an unnatural, ravenous need that chilled him to the bone. He raised his rifle, every muscle in his body tensed as he squinted into the dark. And then he saw it, another flash of movement, a tall, emaciated figure weaving between the trees, barely visible in the dim light. Its body was gaunt, its limbs twisted, and impossibly long, and its eyes. Its eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. He aimed, finger poised on the trigger, but the figure was gone before he could react, vanishing into the shadows like smoke. Ian's hands shook as he lowered the rifle, his mind racing. Whatever this creature was, it seemed to be toying with him, stalking him like prey. Summoning all his courage, Ian moved quickly through the trees, his eyes darting from side to side, his rifle ready. The figure appeared again, further away this time, moving with an unnatural speed, slipping in and out of sight like a ghost. It was leading him, he realized, drawing him further into the forest, away from the safety of his cabin and back into the heart of Frost Hollow. He hesitated, the desire to flee warring with his need for answers. But then he heard a new sound, something softer, more human, a voice, faint and pleading, echoing through the trees. "Help me." His blood ran cold. It was Anna's voice. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind. It couldn't be her. It had to be some sort of trick. But the voice called out again, softer, almost pleading, pulling at him with an urgency he couldn't ignore. "Please, help mem." Without thinking, he moved toward the sound, his every step filling him with dread. He followed the voice, winding deeper into the forest, into a part he had never explored before. The trees grew thicker here, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. The snow was deeper, heavier, untouched by the warmth of sunlight. As he walked, the voice grew fainter, fading until it was little more than a whisper on the wind. He stopped, looking around, realizing with a sinking feeling that he was completely alone. The forest loomed around him, silent and watchful, as if it were waiting for him to make a mistake. Then he saw something that made his stomach lurch, a small, bloodied scrap of cloth caught on a branch, the same faded blue as Anna's hiking jacket. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric, the faint scent of decay reaching his nose. The realization hit him hard. She had been here, right where he was standing, caught in the same web of shadows and silence. The howl sounded again, closer than before, echoing through the trees like the call of some dark god. Ian took a step back, his heart racing, but he stumbled, his foot catching on something hard beneath the snow. He looked down, his pulse quickening as he saw a line of small, bone-white stones arranged in a pattern around him, a circle, like the one he had seen before. Panic flared in his chest, and he tried to move, but it felt as though an invisible force held him in place. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He could feel it now, the presence he had sensed before, dark and oppressive, filling the air with a cold that cut deeper than any winter wind. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees shifting, their shadows lengthening, merging to form a shape, a tall, gaunt figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The Wendigo. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, rotten teeth, and a low growl rumbled from deep within its chest, a sound filled with ancient, insatiable hunger. Ian's hand tightened around his rifle, but he knew it was useless. This creature, whatever it was beyond bullets or human defenses. He could feel it now, a pull in his mind, a creeping hunger that whispered to him, urging him to stay, to surrender to the cold, to let the forest consume him. Join us. The whisper was no longer distant, it was right beside him, filling his ears, his thoughts, as if the Wendigo's hunger was a living thing, coiling around his mind, squeezing tighter and tighter. With a surge of willpower, Ian wrenched himself free of the whisper, stumbling backward, away from the stones, from the shadows, from the creature that watched him with those hollow, ravenous eyes. He turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding as he crashed through the forest, the whisper fading behind him. He didn't stop until he broke free of the trees, emerging into the open air, gasping for breath. The cabin loomed ahead, a beacon of warmth and safety, and he stumbled toward it, slamming the door behind him as he collapsed inside, his mind reeling. But even in the safety of his cabin, he could still feel it, that terrible gnawing hunger, echoing in the corners of his mind, a whisper that would not let him go. Ian sat by the fireplace, the warmth barely reaching him as he clutched a mug of coffee, his hands trembling. His mind churned with what he had seen and heard in the forest, the whispering voice, the twisted figure, the marks in the snow. He couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, staring through him with an insatiable hunger, a hunger that he could still feel deep within his own chest, gnawing like a festering wound. Hours had passed since he'd escaped the forest, but he was far from safe. The whispers lingered in his thoughts, haunting him like shadows he couldn't shake. Every so often he would glance at the windows, half expecting to see that gaunt, twisted figure lurking just beyond the glass, watching him with that terrible, hollow gaze. He tried to distract himself, focusing on the warmth of the fire, the taste of the coffee, the solid walls of his cabin. But the chill within him remained, cold and relentless, like the forest itself had left a mark on him, something dark and ancient sinking its claws into his soul. After what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to his feet, grabbing a pen and his battered notebook from the counter. If he was going to survive this, he needed answers. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. He had read about the Wendigo before, but his knowledge was fragmentary, little more than scattered folklore and legend. He began to jot down notes, anything that could give him a foothold against the creature lurking in the shadows. Wendigo, he wrote, a creature born of cold and starvation, cursed with a hunger that can never be satisfied, said to consume the bodies and souls of its victims, leaving them empty, hollow. He paused, his hand trembling as he remembered the hunger he'd felt in the woods, a hunger that seemed to pulse through him even now, a feeling that something inside him was empty, craving, wanting. He shook his head, trying to focus. The tales spoke of people transforming into Wendigos after resorting to cannibalism, their souls consumed by an insatiable need for flesh. But this was different. There was a knock at his door. Ian froze, his heart racing. It was late, far too late for visitors. The townsfolk knew better than to come out here after dark, especially during winter. He reached for his rifle, his hands shaking as he raised it, moving slowly toward the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint, trembling voice. "Mr. Mitchell, please, open the door." Ian's stomach twisted. It was a voice he recognized. Jacob Harlow, a hunter from town, known for his brash nature and sharp wit, but now his voice was cracked, broken, filled with a fear Ian had never heard before. He slowly opened the door, rifle at the ready, his breath catching as he took in the sight of Jacob standing on his doorstep. The man looked pale, his clothes torn and his face streaked with scratches, as if he had been running through the forest. His eyes were wide, darting around as though expecting something to lunge out from the shadows. "Jacob," Ian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What happened?" Jacob staggered into the cabin, his hands trembling as he grabbed Ian's arm, his grip desperate. It's out there, Ian. It got J-Jo." His voice broke, and he glanced back at the door, his face etched with terror. "We went out hunting near Frost Hollow, trying to find some game. But We heard something, a voice. It sounded like a person, like they were hurt. Joe went to check it out, and his words faltered, and he shook his head, a look of horror in his eyes. It wasn't a person, it was something else. Ian felt his stomach twist. What did you see? Jacob looked down, his hands shaking as he spoke. It was tall, so tall, with bones sticking out of its skin like it was starving. Its eyes. They looked right at me, like it could see right into my soul. Joe. He didn't stand a chance. It tore into him like he was nothing. I ran, Ian. I didn't look back. I just ran. Ian felt a chill crawl up his spine. It was the same creature he had seen, the same twisted figure that haunted his dreams. Did it speak to you? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jacob nodded, his face pale. It whispered, something about hunger, about feeding. It was like it wanted me to know how hungry it was, like it wanted me to feel it. Ian's heart pounded as he remembered the whispers, the insidious hunger that seemed to cling to him even now. Jacob, he said, his voice low, we're dealing with something far beyond our understanding. This thing, whatever it is, it's not just a creature. It's something ancient, something that doesn't belong in this world. Jacob's eyes widened, fear flickering in their depths. What do we do, Ian? How do we fight something like this? Ian clenched his fists, his mind racing. He felt the hunger gnawing at him again, deeper and more intense, like it was spreading through his veins. He pushed the feeling down, focusing on Jacob's question. The Wendigo is a spirit of hunger, he said slowly, thinking of the folklore he had scrawled in his notebook. The stories say it can only be defeated by understanding its nature, by resisting the hunger it represents. Jacob stared at him, his face pale. What does that even mean? It means, Ian said, swallowing hard, we have to keep our wits about us. It feeds on fear, on desperation. If we give in to it, if we let it inside our minds. He paused, remembering the cold emptiness he had felt earlier. Then we become like it, hollow, hungry, lost. Jacob shivered, glancing toward the window as if expecting the creature to appear at any moment. I don't know if I can do that, Ian. I feel like it's already inside me. That hunger. It's everywhere, filling every part of Memem. Ian felt the same way. The hunger pressing against his thoughts, making him feel as if he were starving, as if he could never be satisfied. He clenched his fists, trying to block it out. We have to fight it, Jacob, together. We'll stay here until morning when the light returns. It's weaker in the daylight. The stories say the Wendigo hides from the sun. Jacob nodded, though he looked anything but reassured. The two men sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them, the whispers in their minds growing louder, more insistent. Every so often, Ian would glance at the door, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him, half expecting the voice to speak again. As the hours dragged on, the hunger grew stronger, gnawing at them both. Ian could see the fear in Jacob's eyes, the way his hands twitched, the way his gaze flickered toward the door as if he were considering running back into the forest. Ian felt it too, a primal urge to escape, to flee into the night, to give in to the hunger that clawed at him. But he held firm, clinging to the thought of the sunrise, to the hope that daylight might offer some respite from this nightmare. And as the first faint light of dawn crept through the windows, he felt the hunger begin to ebb, fading like mist under the morning sun. But even as the warmth of day returned, Ian knew the truth. The hunger was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the darkness to return. And he knew that the Wendigo, with its twisted smile and ravenous eyes, would not stop until it had devoured them both. The light of dawn filtered weakly through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the walls. Ian and Jacob sat in silence, both worn and hollow-eyed from the night's haunting ordeal. Though the sun was up, the terrible hunger that had clawed at their minds had only dimmed, never fully leaving. It was as if the creature's essence had woven itself into the very air around them, saturating their every breath with its insatiable thirst. Ian poured himself another cup of coffee, his hands shaking as he gripped the mug. Jacob was slumped in a chair, his face pale and drawn, his eyes haunted. The two men exchanged a brief glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Whatever had marked them last night, it wouldn't leave until it had consumed every last piece of them. "Jacob," Ian said quietly, breaking the silence. "We need to find out what this thing is, why it's here." His voice was firm, though his insides were twisting with fear. "It won't stop unless we stop it." Jacob looked at him, a mixture of dread and desperation in his eyes. "But how, Ian? It's not human. It's a monster. How do we fight something like Tat?" Ian leaned forward, gathering every bit of folklore he had ever heard about the Wendigo. In the stories, the Wendigo is bound to this world by a curse, born out of desperation, starvation, and an act of unspeakable horror. Those who become Wendigos, they're people who were driven to cannibalism to survive. Jacob flinched at Ian's words, but he nodded slowly. "So, are you saying this thing was once human?" Ian sighed, a heavy sadness weighing on him. "That's what the stories suggest. The Wendigo's curse is that it can never stop feeding, never be satisfied. It's damned to roam the woods, searching endlessly for prey, consuming anything that crosses its path. But there are other stories, too." He hesitated, feeling the hunger within him gnawing at the edges of his mind, as if listening to his every word. "They say it can spread, that its hunger infects those who come too close." Jacob swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. "So what does that mean for us?" Ian met his gaze, his voice grim. "It means if we're not careful, we could become like it. This hunger we feel, it's more than just fear. It's the Wendigo's curse, reaching into our minds. If we let it consume us, we'll lose ourselves." Jacob shuddered, his face paling even more. "So what do we do?" Ian took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We need to find where this curse began. If we can find the source, maybe we can break it." Jacob shook his head, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "You're talking about lifting a curse, Ian. That's not something real. That's old legend stuff." Ian's gaze hardened. "So is the Wendigo, Jacob, and we both saw it last night." Jacob fell silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Where do we start?" Ian glanced at his notebook, flipping back to the notes he'd made about Frost Hollow. "The stories say that the Wendigo is drawn to places where its curse began, where someone crossed that line between life and death by eating the flesh of another human." He tried to push the nausea away. "There was a settler village here 100 years ago. The winter that year was harsh, brutal. It was a desperate time, and people vanished." Jacob's eyes widened. "You think someone from that village changed?" Ian nodded slowly. "If we can find their burial ground, maybe we can find a way to end this." The two men prepared to head out, gathering supplies, food, blankets, and anything that might help them survive another night in the unforgiving woods. Ian checked his rifle, not expecting it to be much help, but finding reassurance in its weight nonetheless. As they set out into the forest, they walked in silence, both of them weighed down by the knowledge of what lay ahead. The morning was cold, and a thin fog clung to the trees, wrapping around them like ghostly fingers. Every step felt heavier, as if an unseen force was trying to hold them back, to keep them from reaching their destination. Ian could feel the hunger again, gnawing at his insides, but he forced himself to push it down, to focus on the task at hand. They walked for hours, following old maps and faint trails, until they came upon a clearing, hidden deep within the woods. In the center of the clearing stood a lone stone, weathered and cracked, barely visible under a layer of moss and snow. Carved into its surface was a symbol, a crude circle with lines radiating outward, like a sun or a spider's web. Ian felt a chill run through him as he stared at the stone. This is it," he said softly. "The place where it all began." Jacob's face twisted in disgust as he noticed something near the stone, a shallow pit filled with old bones, half buried and broken, scattered haphazardly as if someone had dug them up and discarded them. The bones were ancient, worn with time, but there were signs of gnaw marks on them, as if something had fed on them long after death. Ian swallowed hard, the hunger flaring within him, stronger than ever. It was as if the Wendigo's presence was stronger here, closer, urging him to give in. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the feeling, trying to hold on to his sense of self. "We have to do something," he said, his voice strained. "We can't just leave it here." Jacob nodded, his face pale but determined. Maybe. Maybe if we put these bones to rest, if we bury them properly, it'll end this curse. The two men worked in silence, digging a grave for the bones, placing each piece gently into the earth. Ian whispered words of blessing, old phrases he'd heard from the elders, asking for peace, for forgiveness, hoping that somehow it would be enough. As they finished, the air grew still, the forest falling silent around them. For a moment, Ian felt a flicker of hope, a sense that they had done something right. But then, as they stood in the clearing, a cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a low guttural growl. They turned, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, the Wendigo. Its twisted, emaciated body loomed in the shadows, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Its mouth stretched into a hideous grin, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. Ian felt the hunger surge within him, stronger than ever, like a fire consuming his insides. He raised his rifle, his hands shaking as he aimed at the creature, but he knew it was useless. This thing was more than flesh and bone. It was a curse, a manifestation of endless hunger and despair. The Wendigo took a step forward, its gaze fixed on them, its presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. Ian felt his mind slipping, the hunger overwhelming him, threatening to consume him from the inside out. And then, in a final act of desperation, he shouted into the cold, empty air, his voice filled with defiance. "You don't belong here. This is not your home. Go back to where you came from." The creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing as if considering his words. For a brief moment, it seemed to falter, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. But then, with a guttural snarl, it lunged forward, its body stretching toward them, claws outstretched. Jacob screamed, raising his own weapon, but Ian grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Run!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the creature's roar. They turned and fled into the forest, the Wendigo's howl echoing behind them, filling the air with its insatiable, unending hunger. Ian could feel it following them, a dark shadow at their backs, relentless and ravenous. But he kept running, refusing to look back, refusing to let it consume him. As they broke through the trees and stumbled back into the open air, the Wendigo's howls faded, retreating into the depths of Frost Hollow, leaving them alone under the pale morning light. They had survived, but Ian knew the truth. The hunger would always be with them now, a dark reminder of the curse that haunted these woods. And as he looked at Jacob, both of them marked by the Wendigo's touch, he realized that some battles could never truly be won. The journey back to Ian's cabin was silent. The two men moved with a sense of urgency, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Despite the daylight, every shadow, every twisted tree branch seemed to hold the shape of the Wendigo, watching, waiting. The creature had left them alive, but Ian felt its presence etched into his bones, its hunger still clawing at the edge of his mind. Back in the cabin, Jacob collapsed onto a chair, his hands shaking as he buried his face in them. Ian paced the floor, struggling to understand what had just happened, feeling as though something vital had shifted within him. We buried the bones," Jacob said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's still here. It didn't work." Ian stopped, turning to face him. "I know. Maybe we didn't understand the curse completely." He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. "But we have to keep trying. There's something in these woods, something that binds that creature here. Maybe the bones were only part of it." Jacob looked up, despair and exhaustion in his eyes. "And what if we can't break it, Ian? What if we're just making it worse?" The words settled heavily between them, and for a moment Ian felt doubt creeping in. But then he remembered the creature's hesitation in the clearing, the way it had flickered, as if his words had affected it somehow. There had to be a reason. "I don't think we're helpless," he said, more to himself than to Jacob. The stories say the Wendigo is bound by its own hunger, by a need it can never fulfill. Maybe we can use that. Jacob looked at him, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. How? We'll need more information, Ian said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. There must be something we're missing, something that explains why it's here, why it's bound to this place. After a quick meal and some rest, Ian decided they needed to visit the town library. The small building had been there since the town was founded, and its dusty archives might hold some old records or legends about Frost Hollow. It was their best lead, even if a faint one. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrave, raised an eyebrow when they entered, noting their disheveled appearance. But she didn't ask questions, simply nodding as Ian and Jacob asked to see any records about Frost Hollow and its earliest settlers. She led them to a dimly lit corner, pulling out several thick, leather-bound volumes, their covers worn from age. Ian and Jacob combed through the records, turning pages filled with faded ink and brittle yellowed paper. Most of it was dry information, dates of settlement, birth and death records, reports of harsh winters and difficult harvests. But as they worked their way through the volumes, a pattern began to emerge. The winter of 1846 had been the worst the town had ever seen. The settlers of Frost Hollow had been isolated by snowstorms, trapped in their homes with dwindling supplies. People had vanished without a trace, some simply lost to the brutal cold, others with no record of burial or return. Rumors of desperation, whispers of madness. But it wasn't until Ian uncovered a personal diary, hidden among the records, that the true horror began to unfold. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret Hill. Her entries were fragmented, filled with references to the isolation and fear, and to something she called the dark spirit of hunger. She spoke of the men of the village venturing out in search of food, and of one man in particular, Isaac. Margaret's words trembled on the page, her fear palpable even after all these years. Isaac came back, but he was changed. His eyes hollow, his words slurred and full of madness. I heard him whispering to himself, talking of hunger, of flesh, of the forest calling him. He's gone now, lost in the woods again. Some say he is dead, others say he has become something else. Ian felt a chill crawl up his spine as he read her words. He glanced at Jacob, who looked equally disturbed. That has to be it, Ian whispered. Isaac. He must be the origin of the curse. Jacob swallowed, looking down at the diary. So he was the first Wendigo? Maybe. Or maybe he was the first to be touched by it. Whatever happened to him out there, it changed him, and it's haunted these woods ever since. They turned to Mrs. Hargrave, who was watching them curiously from the desk. Ian approached her, feeling slightly awkward but driven by urgency. Mrs. Hargrave, do you know anything else about Isaac? Or Frost Hollow? Anything that isn't in these records? The old woman frowned, thinking for a moment. Isaac, she murmured. Oh yes, Isaac Larson. He was a trapper, an unusual one, they say. Went out one winter and came back raving mad. Most folk didn't speak of him after that, said he'd been taken by something dark. His body was never found. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. They say his spirit never left those woods. Ian and Jacob exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the weight of her words. It was exactly as they had feared. The Wendigo was not merely a creature of flesh and bone, but a spirit, something bound to the land by the acts it had committed, by the curse it carried. Leaving the library, Ian mulled over everything they'd learned. He was exhausted, but his mind was racing with possibilities. The stories of the Wendigo always emphasized its curse of unending hunger. Isaac had given in to that hunger, surrendering himself to the darkness. If the curse was tied to his spirit, then perhaps it could be severed, but they would need to confront it on its terms. That evening, as they prepared supplies, Jacob voiced the question that had been hanging between them. Ian, what if we're wrong? What if facing it only makes it stronger? Ian looked at his friend, his heart heavy with the same fear, but he forced himself to speak. Then at least we'll know we tried. It's haunting us, Jacob. If we don't face it, it'll keep coming, keep taking from this place. He hesitated, then continued. We'll go to the heart of Frost Hollow. That's where we'll find Isaac's spirit. If we can confront him, maybe we can break the curse." As darkness fell, they steeled themselves for the journey. This time, they left no room for hesitation. They entered Frost Hollow, tracing their steps back toward the clearing, moving with purpose despite the chill of the night and the shadows pressing in around them. Finally, they reached the clearing, the stone and the freshly turned earth marking the grave of the bones they had buried. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was watching them, holding its breath. Ian took a step forward, his voice carrying into the darkness. "Isaac Larson, we know your name and we know your curse. Show yourself." The wind picked up, swirling around them, and a low, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. The Wendigo emerged, its twisted body unfolding from the shadows, its eyes blazing with a hunger that seemed to burn through Ian's very soul. But this time, Ian didn't flinch. He stared back, unyielding. "You don't have to be this," he shouted, his voice ringing out in defiance. "You were human once. You don't have to keep feeding on this land, on these people." The creature paused, its form wavering, as though his words had struck something deep within it. For a moment, Ian thought he saw the faint outline of a man beneath the twisted, monstrous features, a glimpse of hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, a mouth twisted in sorrow. The Wendigo let out a low, mournful sound, a sound that spoke of despair and loss. It staggered, its body flickering, as though struggling against the curse that bound it. And for that fleeting moment, Ian saw a glimmer of humanity in its gaze. But then, as if realizing its own weakness, the creature let out a roar, lunging toward them with renewed fury. Ian raised his rifle, firing a shot that rang out into the darkness, but he knew it was futile. Just as the creature lunged, Jacob stepped forward, shouting, "Isaac, you don't belong here. Go back to the dark, you are not one of us anymore." The words seemed to pierce the Wendigo's form like a blade. It recoiled, its body shuddering, its face twisted in agony. And with a final echoing cry, the Wendigo dissolved into shadows, melting into the darkness as if consumed by its own hunger. Ian and Jacob stood there, gasping for breath, as silence settled over the clearing once more. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, and Ian could almost feel a sense of peace returning to the woods. They had survived. But as they looked around the clearing, they knew the scars of the Wendigo's curse would linger, a dark memory etched into the land. And they would carry that memory within themselves, a reminder of the hunger that had nearly consumed them both. Ian and Jacob left the clearing with a strange, quiet sense of relief. The Wendigo's form had dissolved into the night, and while they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the terrible hunger that had haunted them felt muted, as if the creature's hold on them had loosened. Still, the night around them felt like a fragile calm, and neither dared to hope the ordeal was truly over. They returned to the cabin in silence, both feeling drained. When they finally spoke, it was in hushed tones, afraid that anything louder might summon something from the darkness. "What happens now?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ian rubbed his temples, exhausted. "I don't know. I think maybe we've weakened the curse." "I felt something shift back there, like a part of Isaac's spirit was released. But it's still here, isn't it?" Jacob's tone was grim, his gaze distant. "The hunger. I can still feel it, faint, but it's there." Ian nodded. He felt it too, a low hum in his mind, like an itch just beneath the surface. "The curse has been here too long. It's part of these woods now, part of the land." Jacob frowned. So, what was the point of confronting it? If it's still here, still haunting these woods, what did we even accomplish? Ian struggled to find the words. He had seen the brief flicker of humanity in the Wendigo, the hint of a broken man trapped within the beast. "I think we gave him some peace. Maybe Isaac was able to let go, a part of him at least." They spent the next day in a fog of exhaustion, resting and reflecting on what they had experienced. Ian kept going back to the library records, reading through every detail in Margaret's diary. Her words, fragmented as they were, hinted at some underlying force, something primal and relentless. Ian wondered if the curse had started with Isaac, or if it had merely claimed him like it had tried to claim them. As evening fell, a sense of unease crept over them. The hunger, which had been a faint murmur all day, was growing again, gnawing at their thoughts, making their stomachs twist with unnatural craving. It was as though the woods themselves were calling them, reminding them that their struggle wasn't finished. Ian tried to ignore it, distracting himself by organizing the notes they'd gathered, but the unease only grew. Jacob's expression mirrored his own, strained, tense, eyes darting toward the forest as though he could sense something lurking just beyond the trees. Finally, Ian spoke, unable to ignore the feeling any longer. I think the curse needs a host. Isaac's spirit is gone, but the hunger, it's looking for someone to replace him. Jacob went pale, his jaw clenched. You mean it's trying to pull us in, to turn us into the next Wendigos? Ian nodded slowly. I think that's what we felt last night, when it started to weaken. It was trying to pass the curse on to us. They looked at each other in silence, the weight of realization settling between them. It wasn't enough to confront the Wendigo. They had to resist its curse, fight against the hunger that threatened to consume them from within. Ian, we can't stay here, Jacob said finally. If we stay, we'll lose ourselves. Ian wanted to argue, to believe they could somehow resist the curse, but he knew Jacob was right. Every passing hour felt like a descent, the call of the hunger growing louder, more insistent. He didn't want to leave his home, but it was clear now that Frost Hollow was no longer safe. Reluctantly, they began gathering their belongings, packing what they could carry. Ian hesitated, looking around the cabin he had called home for so many years, the place that held all his memories of peace and solitude. But those memories were tainted now, twisted by the darkness that clung to these woods. As they stepped outside, the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. The forest seemed to breathe around them, an oppressive stillness filling the air. The urge to stay, to give in to the hunger and become part of the land, gnawed at Ian's mind, but he fought it, forcing himself to move forward. They walked in silence, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the woods themselves were reluctant to let them go. The darkness closed in around them, the shadows twisting into familiar, haunting shapes. Ian could swear he saw Isaac's hollow eyes watching them from the tree line, a lingering presence that would forever be a part of these woods. When they reached the edge of the forest, Ian stopped, turning back to look one last time. Frost Hollow loomed behind him, dark and silent, a place forever changed by the curse that had claimed it. He felt a pang of grief, a sense of loss for something he could never truly leave behind. We'll never be free of it, will we? Jacob said, his voice filled with a weary sadness. Ian shook his head, unable to answer. He knew the truth. The hunger would follow them, haunting their thoughts, a dark reminder of the curse that had nearly consumed them. They had survived, but they would always carry a piece of Frost Hollow with them, a shadow lurking in the corners of their minds. As they walked away from the forest, Ian felt a strange, eerie calm settle over him. The Wendigo's hunger would never fully leave, but he had seen the man beneath the monster, the broken soul trapped within the beast. Perhaps that was the only peace they would ever know, the knowledge that, in the end, Isaac had not been entirely lost. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ian whispered a quiet farewell to the woods that had once been his home, and to the spirit that would haunt Frost Hollow forever. Months passed after Ian and Jacob left Frost Hollow, but the forest and its dark secrets followed them like a shadow. They had returned to the routines of their old lives, work, family, everyday things that felt like distant memories. Yet, every so often, the woods would call to them in dreams, pulling them back to that dark, frozen wilderness and to the eyes of the creature that haunted it. Ian, now back in his small town, found that he couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by dreams of the Wendigo's twisted form and the terrible hunger it carried. No matter how far he went, he could feel the darkness of Frost Hollow reaching out, brushing against his thoughts, whispering in a voice that sounded both familiar and alien. One day, while at a coffee shop in town, Ian spotted an old newspaper headline that caught his eye. Disappearances reported near Frost Hollow. His heart dropped as he read the article. Several hikers had gone missing in the woods, their campsites found abandoned, and no bodies recovered. Locals had started talking about a new curse on the land, warning people to stay away. Ian felt a wave of guilt. He had thought leaving would break the cycle, that the Wendigo's hunger would lose its hold without him or Jacob to feed on. But the curse was relentless, a force beyond reason, beyond mercy. It wasn't something that could simply be left behind. It was part of Frost Hollow, a dark legacy that would never die. That evening, Ian called Jacob, who now lived miles away in a coastal town, hoping the distance had offered him peace. Jacob answered, but his voice sounded tense, guarded, as if he too had been watching the shadows. When Ian brought up the disappearances, Jacob fell silent. It's still happening, isn't it? Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. We couldn't stop it. We only delayed it. Ian nodded, even though Jacob couldn't see him. I think the curse is looking for a new host, just like we feared. They stayed on the phone for hours, discussing the Wendigo, Isaac, and the events in Frost Hollow. But, no matter how much they analyzed and theorized, there was only one conclusion they kept circling back to. Something was calling them, something that wouldn't rest until it had claimed another soul. After they hung up, Ian sat alone in his room, the cold weight of dread settling over him. He had left Frost Hollow to escape the curse, but it had only spread. And he knew that unless they confronted it one final time, it would continue to consume anyone who ventured into its grasp. With renewed determination, Ian began gathering his gear. He knew Jacob would join him, despite the fear. They had both been marked by that night in the clearing, forever bound to the spirit of the Wendigo. They would return to Frost Hollow, not to flee this time, but to end the curse once and for all. A few days later, Ian and Jacob met in a town near the forest's edge, their faces set with grim determination. This time, they weren't venturing into the woods with the hope of survival alone. They were going with the intent to confront the curse head-on, to face whatever dark force had taken root in the forest. They entered Frost Hollow once again, the memories flooding back with every step they took. The forest was silent, the air thick with anticipation, as though it knew why they had returned. As they moved deeper, they felt the hunger intensify, creeping into their minds, tempting them to give in. Finally, they arrived at the old clearing, now overgrown and twisted, the ground marked with the faint outlines of the graves they had dug months before. The air was deathly still, a weight pressing down on them, as if the forest was holding its breath. Ian took a deep breath, calling out to the darkness, Isaac Larson, spirit of the forest, we have returned. We will not leave until this curse is ended. The wind picked up, swirling around them, and from the shadows, the Wendigo appeared. It was twisted and gaunt, its eyes blazing with a hunger that seemed to consume everything around it. But this time, Ian felt no fear, only a deep sadness, a longing to free the soul trapped within. The Wendigo growled, advancing on them, its form flickering like a shadow in the moonlight. But Ian stood firm, speaking with conviction. Isaac, you do not have to continue this. Let go of the hunger. Release your hold on this land. Jacob joined in, his voice steady. Your suffering has haunted these woods long enough. It's time for peace. The Wendigo paused, as if their words had struck something deep within. Its form began to flicker and waver, and for a moment, they saw the outline of a man, a broken hollow figure staring back at them with eyes filled with sorrow and regret. Please, Ian whispered, his voice choked with emotion. You don't have to stay in the darkness anymore. Find peace, Isaac. Release this place from your curse. The Wendigo let out a mournful wail, a sound filled with centuries of suffering and despair. Its form began to dissolve, the twisted body fading into the air, leaving behind only the faint image of a man who had once been lost to the hunger, but who was finally finding release. As the last traces of the Wendigo disappeared, the forest seemed to exhale, the weight of the curse lifting, the darkness receding. The air felt lighter, the silence replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Frost Hollow was still, but there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before, a calm that settled over the land. Ian and Jacob stood in silence, feeling the burden of the curse finally lift from their shoulders. They had come to break the cycle, and for the first time, they believed they had succeeded. Isaac's spirit had been freed, and with it, the hunger that had plagued Frost Hollow for generations. They left the forest as dawn broke, the first light of day spilling over the trees. For the first time in months, Ian felt truly free, the shadows of the Wendigo's curse finally fading from his mind. As they reached the edge of the woods, he turned back one last time, offering a silent farewell to the forest that had both haunted and healed him. Together, Ian and Jacob walked away from Frost Hollow, knowing that the Wendigo's hunger had been laid to rest, and that the forest would no longer call to them in the night. They had finally found peace, not just for themselves, but for the spirit that had once been lost to the darkness, and for the land that could now breathe freely, unbound by the curse that had haunted it for so long. Months passed since Ian and Jacob left Frost Hollow, and life finally seemed to settle into a normal rhythm. Ian, back in his quiet town, no longer felt the weight of the forest haunting him. The nightmares had ceased, the strange pull was gone, and even his memories of that terrible night had begun to blur, softened by time. One late evening, Ian was sitting on his porch, watching the stars. The air was still, calm, almost eerily so. He felt a familiar chill that sent a faint shiver down his spine, and his thoughts turned back to the forest, to the night he and Jacob had confronted the Wendigo for the last time. He knew the curse was broken, he'd felt its grip loosen, felt the calm return to the woods. And yet, something lingered in the quiet, like a whisper from Frost Hollow. A few days later, he received an unexpected call from Jacob. "Ian, I don't know how to explain this." Jacob's voice was low, tense. "But I had a dream. I was back there, in the woods. I saw Isaac." Ian's stomach twisted. "But the curse, it's broken. We saw him let go, Jacob." "I know," Jacob replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But in the dream, he was different. He looked at peace. He thanked us." A chill passed over Ian. He didn't believe in signs, but this dream felt different, almost like Isaac had found a way to reach them from beyond. He wondered if the spirit of the Wendigo had wanted more than just release, if somehow it wanted to leave a parting message. A few days later, a letter arrived on Ian's doorstep, worn and weathered, with no return address. It was addressed in old, careful handwriting, almost as if it had come from another time. Hesitating, he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "To those who freed me, know that I am grateful. The hunger has faded, and the forest has found its peace. But Frost Hollow remembers. Take with you the knowledge of its shadows and of what you saw, for darkness can take root anywhere, in any soul, if left unchecked. Remember what you learned and tell the tale, so others may understand the cost of giving in to the hunger." The letter was unsigned, but Ian didn't need a signature to know who had written it. He felt a strange warmth, a sense of closure he hadn't realized he was missing. Isaac had finally spoken to them, had given them a task, to remember and to share his story, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface. In the months and years that followed, Ian would occasionally share the story of Frost Hollow with those who would listen, a tale of a cursed forest and the spirit they had encountered there. Some dismissed it as fiction, a fireside story meant to entertain, but others listened, a solemn understanding in their eyes. And Ian knew that the tale would continue, a legacy of a curse that had been broken but never forgotten. Jacob moved far from the mountains, yet he too felt the urge to share the story, especially with those who found themselves drawn to the allure of wild, untamed places. He knew that the forest could speak to those who would listen, and he wanted to remind them of the dangers that lay hidden in the shadows. Though Frost Hollow remained silent, though no other signs of the Wendigo's hunger ever surfaced, Ian and Jacob knew that its memory would live on. The land had healed, but the lesson remained, a story whispered in darkened woods, a tale of a curse that had once bound a man to the hunger of a beast. And perhaps, in some distant future, someone else would hear the tale of Frost Hollow and remember to tread carefully in places where darkness ran deep, where the line between man and monster grew thin.